I was 68 years old when my own daughter left me in that nursing home. 68, with $47 in my wallet and a lifetime of carpentry calluses on my hands that nobody seemed to care about anymore. The Harbor View Care Facility. That's what they called it. There was no harbor, and there certainly wasn't any view unless you counted the parking lot where Sarah's Mercedes pulled away that Tuesday morning. I watched from the third-floor window as she drove off without looking back. Mark, her husband, sat in the passenger seat. I could see his head tilted toward her, probably already planning what they'd do with my house. It had been 3 months since Margaret died. 3 months since I'd held my wife's hand in our bedroom and promised her I'd take care of the home we'd built together. The house where we'd raised Sarah, where I'd taught my little girl how to measure twice and cut once, where Margaret had planted roses that still bloomed every June. But Mark had other plans. He'd started talking about it at Margaret's funeral, barely waiting until the last mourner left. "Dad needs care," he'd told Sarah, his arm around her shoulders like he was the concerned one. "The house is too much for him. We should think about assisted living." I wasn't deaf. I wasn't senile. I was grieving. And I was alone. But I could still frame a wall and read a contract. When I'd said no, Mark's jaw had tightened. When I'd said the house was staying in the family, his eyes had gone cold. 2 weeks later, they'd shown up with papers from some doctor I'd never met. Papers that said I was experiencing cognitive decline, that I was a danger to myself. Sarah had cried when she signed me into Harbor View, but she'd signed nonetheless. Mark had driven. The nursing home wasn't cruel, exactly. It was just empty. They took my phone on the first day, said it was for my own good, that I kept calling Sarah and getting confused. They gave me a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old socks. They served dinner at 4:30 in the afternoon. They had an activities director named Brenda, who smiled too much and talked to everyone like they were 5 years old. And every day, I watched that parking lot and waited for Sarah to come back and say she'd made a mistake. She never did. Instead, I found out the truth from a nurse named Rita who talked too much. She'd been gossiping with another aide, not realizing I was sitting right there in the common room. "The daughter's husband is selling the family house," Rita had said, shaking her head. "Got power of attorney somehow. Poor old guy doesn't even know." My hands had started shaking then, not from age, from rage. That night, I made my plan. They kept my clothes in a locked closet, but I'd been picking locks since I was 12 years old. A paperclip from the activities room, 3 minutes of work, and I had my jacket, my boots, and the one pair of pants they'd let me keep. My wallet was in the pocket, exactly where I'd left it, $47. My last Social Security payment had been deposited 2 days before Sarah signed me in, and I'd managed to withdraw this much from the ATM on the way to Harbor View. Everything else was gone now. My account transferred to Sarah's control through that power of attorney I'd never actually signed. I waited until 2 in the morning when the night shift was watching television in the break room. The front door wasn't locked from the inside. Why would it be? Nobody expected 68-year-old men with cognitive decline to have the sense to run. The November air hit my face like freedom. I walked for an hour before I had to stop and rest, my hip aching the way it always did when rain was coming. I'd made it to downtown Millbrook, the old coastal town where Margaret and I had honeymooned 43 years ago. We'd always talked about retiring here, buying one of those little cottages near the water. That dream felt like it belonged to someone else now. I sat on a bench outside the closed hardware store and tried to figure out what to do next. $47. No phone, no home, no daughter who cared enough to believe her own father over her manipulative husband. That's when I saw the notice in the store window. Public auction, county property, this Saturday at 10 a.m. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. They were selling tax-delinquent properties. The list included a mobile home, 2 vacant lots, and something called Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage, Beacon Point Road. I knew Beacon Point. It was at the end of the peninsula, where the old lighthouse still stood, abandoned since the Coast Guard automated everything back in the 80s. Margaret and I had driven past it once, and she'd called it romantic. I'd called it a fixer-upper. The minimum bid was $50. I had $47. The hardware store opened at 7. I was waiting on the bench when the owner, a man about my age with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes, unlocked the door. He'd looked at me for a long moment, taking in my wrinkled clothes and the way I was shivering in the morning cold. "You okay, friend?" he'd asked. "I need to borrow $3, I'd said. "Just 3. I'll pay you back." His name was Ray Martinez, and he didn't ask questions. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed me a $5 bill. "Keep it," he'd said. "You look like you could use a hot coffee too. There's a pot inside." That Saturday, I was the only person who showed up to the auction. The county clerk, a thin woman with glasses on a chain, had seemed almost disappointed as she'd called out the properties one by one. When she got to the lighthouse keeper's cottage, I'd raised my hand. $50, I'd said. My voice steady, even though my hands weren't. "Sold," she'd said, sounding surprised. "To bidder number 4, Mr. Thomas." She'd glanced down at the registration form I'd filled out. Mr. Thomas Brennan. I'd counted out the bills carefully. 47 from my wallet, 3 from Ray, and the 2 I had left from his 5. $52 total. The clerk had given me $2 in change and a deed to a property I'd never seen. The cottage was worse than I'd imagined. The roof had more holes than shingles. The windows were broken. The door hung from one hinge. Inside, everything was covered in a decade of dirt, bird droppings, and the desiccated remains of what I hoped were mice and not rats. But it was mine. Legally. Properly mine. I had the deed in my pocket, signed and notarized. I'd stood there in the doorway, looking at the disaster I'd just purchased, and for the first time in 3 months, I'd laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you've hit bottom and realized the only way out is up. The first night, I'd slept in my jacket on the only piece of furniture the previous owner had left behind. A wooden chair with 3 legs. I'd propped it against the wall and dozed, sitting up, too cold and too overwhelmed to do anything else. When dawn came through the broken windows, I'd woken up stiff and aching, but alive. And I'd had an idea. The lighthouse was still there, 50 yards from the cottage, standing like a sentinel over the rocky beach. I'd walked to it that morning, testing the door. Locked, but the wood was rotten around the hinges. It took me 20 minutes, and a rock to break in. Inside, the spiral staircase was intact. The lens room at the top was dusty but undamaged. The light mechanism was still there, decades old, but solid. The manual override was still functional. I'd stood up there, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, and I'd understood something. This wasn't just a cottage. This wasn't just a refuge. This was a project. This was purpose. I'd walked back to town that afternoon, to Ray's hardware store. He'd looked up from the counter when I came in, and his eyes had widened slightly at my appearance. I probably looked worse than I had 3 days ago. "I need to ask you something," I'd said. "And I need you to be honest with me." "All right," Ray had said carefully. "I bought the old lighthouse keeper's cottage at the county auction. I need supplies to fix it up. I have exactly $2 left to my name. I'm 68 years old, and my daughter put me in a nursing home because her husband wants to sell my house out from under me. I escaped. I'm not going back. I'm a carpenter by trade, and I'm good with my hands. But I need help. I need someone to front me materials, and I'll work it off. Any job you need done, I'll do it for free until the debt is paid." Ray had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said, "What's your name?" "Thomas. Thomas Brennan." "Well, Thomas Brennan, I'm Ray Martinez. I've owned this store for 32 years. You know what I've learned in that time?" I'd shaken my head. "I've learned that a man who's honest about where he stands is a man worth helping. I've also learned that this town has plenty of widows who need their porches fixed and their gutters cleaned, and I'm too damn old to keep climbing ladders. You do those jobs. I'll supply the materials for your cottage. We'll call it even." I'd had to turn away so he wouldn't see my eyes water. That's how it started. Ray gave me the basics that first day. A tarp for the roof, some plywood for the windows, a Coleman stove, a sleeping bag, and a box of canned goods. "You can't work if you can't eat," he'd said, loading everything into the back of his ancient pickup truck. "And you can't sleep if you're freezing to death." He'd driven me back to the cottage, helped me unload, And before he left, he'd handed me a gallon jug of water. Pump's probably contaminated, he'd said, nodding toward the old well. Don't drink from it until you can test it. I'll bring more water tomorrow. That night, I'd eaten beef stew straight from the can and slept in a sleeping bag on the floor, the tarp keeping most of the rain off my head. It was the best I'd felt in months. The work was hard. My hands remembered what to do, but my body didn't recover the way it used to. I'd work until my hips screamed, rest for an hour, then work again. Ray came by every few days, always with more water, sometimes with groceries. Store had a sale, he'd say, handing me bread and peanut butter. Or, wife made too much chili. You'd be doing us a favor. I knew what he was doing, and I loved him for it. I fixed Mrs. Henderson's porch. I cleaned out the Johnsons' gutters. I rebuilt the steps at the church. And slowly, the cottage came together. I replaced the roof. I fixed the windows. I got the old wood stove working. I patched the walls and sealed the drafts. Ray tested the well water for me. It was clean, cold, and tasted better than anything I'd had in years. I had water. I had food. I had a roof that didn't leak. I had purpose. And then, 6 weeks after I'd bought the cottage, Sarah showed up. I'd been outside, replacing some rotten boards on the cottage's small porch, when I'd heard a car coming down the long dirt road. Not many people came out to Beacon Point. When I saw the Mercedes, my stomach had dropped. Sarah got out slowly, looking around like she'd stepped onto another planet. She was wearing a cream-colored coat I didn't recognize, and heels that were completely impractical for the gravel driveway. Mark stayed in the car, watching through the windshield. "Dad?" Her voice was small, uncertain. I'd set down my hammer and stood up, my knees popping. "Sarah, they said you ran away from Harborview. We've been looking everywhere. We filed a missing persons report. The police said you were seen in Millbrook." But she'd trailed off, looking at the cottage, at me, in my work clothes, at the evidence of everything I'd been doing. "What is this place?" "It's mine," I'd said. "I bought it. Fair and square. County auction." "With what money?" "Dad, you don't have any money. We set up your accounts so you could control them," I'd finished. "I know about the house, Sarah. I know Mark's selling it." Her face had gone pale. "It's not like that. Dad, you need care. The house was too much for you. After Mom died, you weren't thinking clearly. And I'm thinking clearly now," I'd said, and my voice had been harder than I'd intended. "Clear enough to know that the house was mine, and you had no right to put me in that place. Clear enough to know that I never signed any power of attorney, which means whatever Mark's doing is fraud. That's not—" She'd looked back at the car, at Mark, and I'd seen something flicker across her face. Doubt, maybe. Or guilt. "The doctor said you were experiencing cognitive decline." "What doctor?" "I never saw a doctor. You want to talk about cognitive decline? Let's talk about how a man with cognitive decline managed to buy property, renovate a cottage, and run a handyman business. Let's talk about how I'm out here supporting myself while your husband is stealing my home." Sarah had started crying then, and part of me had wanted to comfort her the way I had when she was little. But another part, the part that had spent 3 months in a nursing home watching a parking lot and waiting for her to come back, that part stayed hard. "He said it was for the best," she'd whispered. "He said you'd be taken care of, that the money from the house would pay for your care long term. He said it was what Mom would have wanted. Your mother wanted me to keep our home. She wanted me to live in the house we built together. She wanted family to matter more than money." Mark had gotten out of the car then, walking over with that confident stride he always had. "Thomas," he'd said, like we were old friends, "you're looking well. Sarah's been worried sick." "I bet she has," I'd said. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. Harborview wasn't working out, clearly. But there are other facilities, better ones. We can find something that—" "I'm not going back to a nursing home." "You can't live here," Mark had said, and his voice had an edge now. "This place is a shack. You're 68 years old. What happens when you fall? When you have a medical emergency? There's no phone here. No neighbors. You'll die out here. And Sarah will have to live with that. I'll die when God decides, I'd said. Not when you decide it's convenient. Mark's expression had changed then. The friendly mask had slipped, just for a second, and I'd seen what was underneath. Anger. Calculation. The house is already in escrow, he'd said quietly. The sale closes in 30 days. The money's going into a trust for your care. It's done. Then you'd better hope that trust holds up in court, I'd said. Because I never signed anything, which means you forged my signature on the power of attorney. That's fraud, Mark. That's a felony. He'd gone very still. Sarah had looked between us, her face crumpling. Mark, she'd said, what is he talking about? Your father is confused, Mark had said. But his voice was tight now. The stress of everything. Losing Margaret. The move to Harbor View. He's not remembering things correctly. I remember everything, I'd said. And I've got a lawyer looking into it. I didn't. Not yet. But I'd seen the flash of fear in Mark's eyes. And I'd known I was right. They'd left without another word. Mark had practically dragged Sarah to the car. She'd looked back once, her face pale and confused, before the Mercedes disappeared down the road. That night, I hadn't been able to sleep. I'd sat in my cottage, in the chair I'd repaired, and I'd thought about my daughter crying, about the little girl who used to hand me nails while I worked, who'd called me her hero. Ray found me the next morning, sitting on the porch and staring at nothing. He'd brought coffee in a thermos and a bag of pastries from the bakery in town. Heard you had visitors yesterday, he'd said, sitting down beside me. Small towns. Everyone knew everything. My daughter and her husband, I'd said. The ones who put you in the nursing home? I'd nodded. What'd they want? To put me back. Ray had been quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. You going? No. Good. You've done good work out here, Thomas. Real good work. Towns noticed. Mrs. Chen was telling everyone at church about how you fixed her grandson's wheelchair ramp. Didn't charge her a penny. I owe you for the materials. The materials cost less than the quote she got from the contractor, Ray had said. You're doing fine. That afternoon, Ray brought his grandson, Luis, out to the cottage. Luis was about 30, wearing a suit that looked out of place in the coastal wind. Luis is a lawyer, Ray had said. Up in Portland. I told him about your situation. Luis had shaken my hand with a firm grip. Mr. Brennan, my grandfather says you may have been the victim of elder fraud. Is that correct? I'd told him everything. About Margaret's death, about Mark's pressure to sell, about the nursing home, about the power of attorney I'd never signed. Luis had taken notes, his expression growing darker. I'll need to see documentation, he'd said. But if what you're saying is true, this is textbook financial exploitation of an elderly person. Your son-in-law could face serious charges. The property sale can be voided. You could get your house back. I don't want my house back, I'd said, surprising myself. I want Sarah to have it. It's her inheritance. But I want Mark to face consequences for what he did, and I want to make sure Sarah knows the truth. Luis had nodded slowly. I can work with that. Let me make some calls. In the meantime, you should document everything. Write down dates, conversations, anything you remember. That night, I'd started writing. Everything from the funeral to Harbor View to the cottage. Every detail I could remember. The next week, I'd been working on the lighthouse itself, trying to see if I could get the old light functioning, when I'd heard a truck coming down the road. Not Ray's truck, something newer. I'd climbed down from the lighthouse and walked back toward the cottage, my toolbox in hand. A man I didn't recognize was standing by the cottage, looking around. He was younger, maybe 45, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Help you? I'd called. He'd turned, and his face had been friendly. You, Thomas Brennan? That's me. Name's Pete. Pete Wilson. I own the garage in town. Ray Martinez. Said you're pretty handy with repairs? I get by. My truck's been making a noise. Grinding sound when I brake. I was going to take it to the dealer, but Ray said you might take a look. I'll pay, of course. I'd wiped my hands on my pants. Let me hear it. Pete had started the truck and backed up a few feet. The grinding noise was obvious. I'd had him pop the hood, and I'd spent 20 minutes looking at the brake system. What I'd found had made my blood run cold. "Pete," I'd said slowly, "when's the last time you had your brakes serviced?" "About 6 months ago." "Why?" "Because someone's cut your brake lines." His face had gone white. "What?" I'd shown him the clean cuts, the way the fluid was leaking. This wasn't wear and tear. This wasn't corrosion. Someone did this on purpose. Pete had called the police from his cell phone. I'd waited with him, my mind racing. Who would cut someone's brake lines? And why? The police had come, taken photos, asked questions. Pete had given them a list of people who might have access to his truck. I'd answered their questions, told them what I'd found. After they left, Pete had looked at me with something like awe. "Ray was right about you. You just saved my life. Just glad I caught it," I'd said. But that night, lying in my sleeping bag, I couldn't stop thinking about those cut brake lines. Clean cuts. Deliberate. And I'd thought about Mark's face when I'd mentioned lawyers and fraud charges. I'd thought about how desperate he must be getting. How much money he stood to lose if that house sale fell through. I'd thought about my old truck, parked behind the cottage. The truck I'd been driving since before Margaret died. The truck I'd left at Harbor View and Ray had helped me retrieve last week. I'd gotten up, grabbed my flashlight, and gone outside. My hands had been shaking as I'd climbed underneath the truck, following the brake lines from the master cylinder to the wheels. There, clean cuts, fresh. I'd slid out from under the truck and sat on the ground, my heart pounding. Mark had been here. Mark had found me, and he'd tried to kill me. I'd called Luis the next morning from Ray's store phone. He'd driven down that afternoon with a sheriff's deputy. They'd documented everything, taken photos, called in a forensic team. The deputy had looked at me with concern. "Mr. Brennan, do you have somewhere safe you can stay? If someone's trying to hurt you, I'm staying here," I'd said. "This is my home. I won't be chased off again. At least let us keep a patrol car in the area," the deputy had said. "Check on you regularly." I'd agreed to that. Luis had pulled me aside before he left. "Thomas, I've been looking into your case. The power of attorney your son-in-law used? It's a forgery. The signature doesn't match any of your legal documents. I've filed a motion to void the property sale, and I've presented evidence of elder abuse and fraud to the district attorney. They're building a case." "How long?" I'd asked. "These things take time. But with the attempted murder added on, they're taking it very seriously." That night, I couldn't sleep. I'd kept thinking about Sarah, about how she'd looked when Mark dragged her away, about the doubt in her eyes when I'd called him a fraud. I'd wondered if she knew, if she'd been part of it, or if she was as much a victim as I was. The storm hit 3 days later. November in coastal Maine is unpredictable, and this one came in fast. The wind had started picking up around noon, and by 3 o'clock, the sky was black. Ray had driven out to check on me, bringing extra batteries and water. "You sure you don't want to come stay in town?" he'd asked. "This is going to be a bad one." "I'll be fine," I'd said. "Cottage is solid now, and I've weathered worse." Ray had looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got my number. Anything happens, you call." By 6 o'clock, the power was out across the peninsula. The wind was howling, and rain was coming down in sheets. I'd lit candles, fired up the wood stove, and settled in to wait it out. That's when I'd heard the boat motor. I'd gone to the window, peering out into the darkness. Through the rain, I'd seen lights on the water. A boat, too close to the rocks, fighting the waves. Even from here, I could see it was in trouble. I'd grabbed my rain slicker and flashlight and run outside, fighting the wind. From the cliff edge, I'd been able to see the boat more clearly. It was a small cabin cruiser, being tossed around like a toy. As I watched, a wave had caught it and slammed it against the rocks. The engine had died. Someone was screaming. I'd run for the lighthouse. The door had stuck, swollen from the rain, but I'd forced it open and taken the stairs 2 at a time, my hips screaming in protest. In the lens room, I'd found the manual override, the one I'd been tinkering with all week. I'd pulled the lever, and nothing had happened. I'd spent 5 frantic minutes checking connections, tightening bolts, praying. Then I'd tried again. The lighthouse had blazed to life. The beam had cut through the storm like God's own spotlight, illuminating the rocks, the boat, the water. I'd aimed it at the safest approach, sweeping it back and forth in the old distress pattern Margaret and I had learned during our Coast Guard tour years ago. Below, the boat's captain had seen the light. I'd watched as he'd fought with the wheel, using the last of his momentum to steer away from the rocks, following the beam to the small beach beside the cottage. The boat had run aground there, hard enough to knock loose whatever was still attached, but on sand instead of rocks. I'd run back down, my knees nearly giving out on the descent, and stumbled through the storm to the beach. The boat's captain was already climbing out, soaked and shaking. In the lighthouse beam, I could see his face. It was Mark. He'd looked at me, and I'd seen everything in his eyes. Fear, shock, recognition. "Thomas," he'd gasped. "The boat. The engine died." I couldn't. "Get inside," I'd said. Because whatever else he was, whatever he'd done, he was a human being about to die of hypothermia. And I was Margaret's husband. I'd made a promise to her about the man I'd be. I'd gotten him into the cottage, wrapped him in blankets, made him drink hot coffee. He'd sat by the wood stove, shaking, not meeting my eyes. "Why were you out there?" I'd finally asked. "I was looking for you," he'd said quietly. "I was going to." "Going to what?" "But I'd already known. You were going to cut my boat lines? Push me into the water? Make it look like an accident?" He'd started crying then. Actual tears. "I'm in so much debt, Thomas. Gambling. I owe people. Bad people. When Margaret died, and I saw how much that house was worth, I thought I could fix everything. Pay everyone off. Start over. Sarah doesn't know. She can't know. It'll destroy her. You tried to kill me," I'd said. I know. And you saved me anyway. Why? Why would you do that?" I'd looked at this man, this pathetic, desperate man, who'd stolen my home, forged my signature, tried to murder me twice, and I'd thought about Margaret, about the woman who'd taught me that anger was easy, but forgiveness took strength. "Because that's what the light is for," I'd said. "It doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It just shows the way home." The Coast Guard had arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by the lighthouse beam. They'd brought medical supplies, and they'd brought the sheriff's deputy I'd been working with. Mark had confessed everything then, there in my cottage, with the wood stove crackling and the storm raging outside. He'd told them about the forged signature, the nursing home, the brake lines, and tonight's planned accident. They'd taken him away in handcuffs. He'd looked back at me once, his face hollow, and I'd wondered what Sarah would say when she found out. I'd gotten my answer the next morning. Sarah had shown up at dawn, before the cleanup crews had even finished clearing the storm debris. She'd run from her car and thrown her arms around me, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "I didn't know," she'd kept saying. "Dad, I swear I didn't know. The gambling, the debt, the forged papers. I thought you really were sick. I thought I was doing the right thing." I'd held my daughter and let her cry, the way I'd done when she'd skinned her knee at 6, when her first boyfriend had broken her heart at 16, when her mother had died 3 months ago. "I know," I'd said. "I know you didn't." Luis had gotten the house sale voided. The title was put in Sarah's name, the way Margaret and I had always planned. Sarah had divorced Mark while he was awaiting trial. She'd sold the house herself, divided the money in half, and given me my share. "I don't need it," I'd told her. "I know you don't," she'd said. "But Mom would want you to have it, and I want you to have it. Please, Dad, let me do this one thing right." I'd taken the money, and I'd used it to do something Margaret would have loved. The lighthouse keeper's cottage became a shelter. A real one, registered with the state, with beds and heat and a kitchen. A place for people like me, people who'd been thrown away, people who just needed somewhere to land while they figured out their next step. Sarah helped me run it. She'd quit her job in marketing and enrolled in social work classes. "I want to help people," she'd told me. "The way you helped me see the truth." The lighthouse stays on every night now, sweeping across the water, showing the way to anyone who's lost. I'm 70 now. My hip still aches when it rains, and my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. But every morning, I wake up in my cottage, and I look out at the lighthouse, and I remember what Margaret taught me. The light you keep burning isn't just for you. It's for everyone lost in the dark. It's for the desperate man in a sinking boat. It's for the daughter who made a terrible mistake. It's for the people who show up at my door with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and eyes that have forgotten how to hope. Ray still stops by every week, now to visit, rather than to check on me. "You did good, Thomas," he'd said last Sunday, watching Sarah teach a resident how to patch drywall. "Your wife would be proud." I think he's right. I hope he's right. Because in the end, that's what this was all for. Not revenge. Not justice, though justice came. This was about keeping a promise to the woman I loved. About being the man she believed I was. About understanding that the worst thing that ever happened to me, being left in that nursing home with $47 and nowhere to go, was also the beginning of the best thing I ever did. Mark's in prison now. He'll be there for a while. Sometimes I think about writing to him, but I don't know what I'd say. Sarah writes to him sometimes, even after everything. She says everyone deserves a chance at redemption. She learned that from me, I guess. And I learned it from a woman who planted roses that still bloom every June, who believed that light should shine for everyone, who made me promise to take care of our home. I kept that promise, just not the way either of us expected. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water tonight, like it does every night, showing the way home to anyone who needs it. And in the cottage below, the lights are warm, and there's always room for one more person who needs a safe place to land. That's what the light is for. That's what we're all for, if we're brave enough to shine.